And we are now recording this event. And welcome to today's Wednesday webinar. We'll be talking about beef basics, things to consider before starting your small beef herd. This session will be recorded and it's available at the link at extension.umd.edu/women in ag. We'd like to shout out to our sponsors and collaborators of the Women in Ag program. Thank them a lot for their help and support over the year. We have webinars scheduled through December, and we have archive webinars that are posted on the webpage as well, so you can check those out. At this time, I'm going to turn today's session over to the presenter, Sarah Potts. And at this time, too, if you have any questions, we haven't enabled mics. So if you have questions or comments, please use the chat pod, reply to all if we have any questions to share. So, Sarah? Looks good.
All right, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right, well, thanks everyone for tuning in today, and thanks Shannon for inviting me to present. Today's talk is beef basics, things to consider before starting your small beef herd. As Shannon said, my name is Sarah Potts. I am the dairy and beef specialist with University of Maryland Extension. I've been in this position for a little over a year now, so I'm still learning the ropes of extension, but I have enjoyed it so far. And I'm excited to talk to you about this important topic today. So, and as Shannon mentioned, if you have questions as we go along, please place them in the, type them into the chat box and we'll answer them at the end. I can advance next slide. There we go. So before we get started, I just want to kind of set the stage a little bit. I know when you're thinking about starting a new program or anything new, a new business endeavor, it can be overwhelming to decide where to start. I know for me, it's really challenging when I have multiple things that I need to get done, or there's multiple paths you can take to achieve the same goal, and it can be paralyzing sometimes. So today I just want to kind of guide you in your journey and kind of help you decide where you should actually start. Before we do that, though, I first want to walk you through the basic structure of the beef industry in case you are not familiar with it, so you are familiar with some of the terms that I'll be using for the rest of the presentation. And this is just going to be a very basic overview of the beef industry structure. There are a lot of deviations from this that are in the industry. So first we'll start with a cow-calf producer, and their primary role is to produce weaned calves. And those calves will generally go to a stocker outfit or a stocker operation. They will also generate replacement animals, so replacement heifers, breeding bulls, etc., that will either be used in their own operation or sold to other producers as well. Then we'll have our stocker calves. Once they're a little bit bigger, they'll enter the finisher phase. So those yearling cattle will be sent to the finisher. And then from the finisher, those animals can be sold directly to the consumer through direct marketing avenues such as farmers markets, or if you have a farm stand, or some other type of way to send those animals to get those products to the consumer. The alternative would be to send those finished cattle directly to a packer. And a cow-calf operation also is going to be producing cull animals, cull breeding stock, or animals that don't get pregnant or don't fit the system anymore. Those are also going to be going to the packer as well. After the packer, those products will be sold to the wholesaler, and then from the wholesaler, they'll go to retail, and then those products will then go to the consumer through grocery stores and restaurants and things like that. So this is a very basic outline of the beef industry structure, but I wanted to present this to you so you can start thinking about where you might want to be, or where you're thinking you want to be in terms of starting your beef herd. And I will point out that a lot of times what we'll see, at least in our area, is that our cow-calf producers will actually combine the cow-calf operation with a stocker or a backgrounding operation, and they'll sell larger weight calves to a finisher, or they'll even finish them all the way out from cow-calf all the way to the finish. So I just wanted to point that out. That is an option. So what type of operation is right for you? That's what we're here for today. So I always like to say you should start with the end in mind. The first thing you should do is define your end product. So if you are interested in selling weaned calves, obviously you're going to want to pursue a cow-calf operation. Or maybe you're interested in selling stocker or yearlings. You don't want to have animals year-round and you just want to have them part of the year. Then a stocker or a backgrounding operation might be a good fit for you. Maybe you want to sell finished cattle, or maybe you want to sell breeding stock. And then in that regard, we get into discussions related to registered versus commercial animals. So a registered animal is an animal that's registered with the breed association, and a lot of times those types of animals are going to be used for breeding stock for other cow-calf producers. The next thing you want to start thinking about is who your buyer is going to be. So if you're interested in selling directly to the consumer, then that is something you need to plan for when you're deciding what type of operation you want. You can also sell to the packer, or you might be selling to other farmers. So if you're selling to other farmers, this could be in the capacity of selling weaned calves to stockers, or selling backgrounded or larger animals to feedlot operators. And even further, if you're interested in producing breeding stock, you'd be selling to those breeding replacements to cow-calf producers. But it's important to have this in mind so that you know what type of product your buyers want. The next thing you need to consider are any personal goals. I know some folks sometimes overlook this, but it's still important at the end of the day that you have any personal goals. Keep that in mind when you're setting up your business. Will this endeavor be a significant source of income for you? If so, that's important to know ahead of time. Or is it something you're just interested in pursuing on the side? Is it something you want to pursue because you want to be self-sufficient and produce your own food and provide food for your family and your neighbors? Is this going to be something that you're interested in pursuing for a 4-H project or a family project? Or are you interested in pursuing certifications like organic or grass-finished animals? Those are all things you need to consider before you get started. In addition, before you start, there's a few things, housekeeping type things you need to pay attention to as well. The first is going to be zoning regulations and land availability in your area, and this can dictate the type of production system you are legally allowed to have, as well as you want to pay attention to the availability of housing, feed, and watering systems for the animals. If your property does not have adequate structures available to you now, are you going to be able to feasibly and economically put those in place for the animals? You also need to pay attention to whether or not you have access to veterinary care. Now, this sometimes is overlooked because we think vets are everywhere, but large animal vets are sometimes hard to come by. And specifically in our area, where the equine industry is very well developed, it can be difficult to get veterinarians who are willing and able to work with cattle. You also need to consider time management. So some segments of the production chain actually require a lot of time, whereas others are much less intensive and don't require as much time. So you need to think about what kind of time, how much time you're willing and able to commit to this endeavor. And then one last thing you might want to consider is other animals on your property. So if you have horses or sheep or other animals, potential for disease transmission among those animals, and potentially issues with feed additives being toxic to certain types of animals. So for example, an ionophorus fed to cattle, sometimes called rumensin, for example, that's toxic to horses. So obviously you wouldn't put rumensin in the diet for your cattle if you have horses in the same field. So just minor things like that, but things you should still consider nonetheless. All right, so what I'm going to do now is go through the 3 major live animal components of the industry: the cow-calf operation, the stocker backgrounder operation, and the finisher operation, and just give you an idea of what each of those kind of entails and some of the nuances for each of those segments. So starting out with the cow-calf operation, the main goal of the cow-calf operation is for every cow to wean at least one calf per year that you can sell. And cow-calf operations, I do want to point out, do require special consideration with regard to time management, because there are times during the life cycle of the cow where she does require significant time and management. There are several different possible end products possible with the cow-calf operation. The one we think of most readily is going to be weaned calves, and those are going to be calves that are between 500 and 600 pounds usually. And those can either be sold to a stocker operation or retained and backgrounded on the cow-calf operation themselves. The next possible product is backgrounded calves, so that would be these weaned calves that are raised further to higher weights, usually to between 8 and 1,000 pounds. And then we can also produce finished cattle from a cow-calf operation. A lot of producers do actually pursue that route in this area, where they take the calves all the way from weaning all the way to finished weights here. And as a side note, if for registered individuals in particular, but also for commercial producers as well, they can also have the possibility of selling breeding stock, so replacement heifers and breeding bulls to other cow-calf producers as well. In terms of the housing needs for a cow-calf operation, a lot of times folks think that they need to have a barn, but that's not necessarily true. A lot of our cow-calf operations are actually mostly on pasture. This is not just true of Maryland, but it's also true across the entire country. But we do recommend at least having 2 acres of pasture per cow. But that number can vary a little bit depending on what you're trying to obtain from your pasture, whether you are relying on your pasture for your animal's nutrition or simply just, an exercise area. That 2-acre recommendation can change a little bit. The next requirement or recommendation is shelter and shade. This is particularly important in inclement or hot weather. So in terms of shelter, yes, you can have a barn, but you can also rely on natural structures like trees and things like that. And when we say shelter, we're not just talking about a roof over the animal's head, but we're also talking about a windbreak, which is particularly important in the winter, especially when it's wet outside. In terms of shade, again, natural structures are usually sufficient, so having trees in a paddock and things like that. But shade is really important, especially when there's hot weather, like we've had in the last week or so, where we are. It's been in the upper to mid to upper 90s every single day for the last 5 days. Shade is very, very important. And again, that can be natural shade, but it could also be man-made shade, shade cloths, barns, and things like that will also provide shade. And then lastly, for a cow-calf operation, we recommend having some type of handling facility for the animals. And this would include something like a head chute or a head gate, which is shown here. But these are really important to have for routine health and reproductive management procedures. So if you are pregnancy checking your cows or putting ear tags in or doing some sort of health procedure, it's really important to have them restrained properly so that you don't get injured and they don't get injured. In terms of feeding management basics, I mentioned earlier that most cow-calf producers will have animals on pasture. So a lot of folks will actually rely on pasture for a good portion of their animal's nutrition. And for about 3/4 of the year in this part of the country, if there is sufficient quantity and quality of pasture, that is enough. But in times when, say, hot, dry summer, which it has been around here for the last couple weeks, or in the wintertime, you will have to think about providing some supplemental feed, like hay or grain. So it's important to have, a way to get those feeds, but also to feed them to the animals. So you need to be able to have a place that's suitable for feeding hay and grain if necessary. And then water, of course, we can't forget about water. The cattle need to have access to water at all times. There are permanent and temporary watering type systems available depending on what type of management system you have on your farm. But it's important that waterers are checked at least once a day, especially during times when it's really cold out to make sure it's not frozen, but also in times when it's really hot to make sure it's not running dry. In terms of cow management, some nuances of the cow-calf operation that are a little bit different from other parts of the beef industry. For the cow-calf operation, generally we're going to be thinking about reproductive management of the cow because that's what we're after. We want her to birth a calf and raise a calf, and that has to do with reproduction. So generally, we recommend having a defined calving season for your cows, whether you have 5 cows or 10 cows. This can be really helpful in terms of time management, so that you know, for example, all of your cows are due to calve in between March and April. You're going to be really busy in March and April. Whereas if you're year-round calving, it's kind of sparsed out throughout the year, and you're kind of, you've got 2 cows in April or 3 cows in June, and it's kind of all over the place. So it is much easier to manage your time if you have a defined calving season. And in terms of calf marketing, it actually is it's more valuable to have a uniform group of calves rather than a couple that are 600 pounds and a couple that are 300 pounds, etc. We'll talk about selling calves here shortly, but a lot of folks will want uniform groups of calves when they do go to sale. And in this part of the country, a lot of folks will calve in the spring, so that takes advantage of the lush spring pastures, and when the cow's energy and nutrient requirements are really high after she calves. But there are some folks that also do fall calving, where the cows will calve in the fall, so say September, October, and then they'll winter feed, and then they'll graze again in the springtime. But those are the 2 most popular options for a defined calving season. Now, I mentioned earlier, year-round calving can be more difficult for time management purposes and calf marketing purposes, but there are certain circumstances where that can be advantageous. And in certain situations where maybe you're interested in selling freezer beef and you have a steady supply of customers throughout the entire year, and you want to make sure that you have enough supply throughout the entire year, then year-round calving might be advantageous in that type of situation. In terms of how the cows are getting pregnant, you need to think about how you're going to do that. So for folks that only have a couple of cows, like 4 or 5 cows, artificial insemination might be the way to go, provided that you do have access to someone that is competent in doing the artificial insemination, actually completing the procedure. There is some cost associated with artificial insemination. Obviously, you have to purchase the semen, you have to pay the technician to come out to breed the cows, and you also have to either watch for signs of heat or estrus, or you can use synchronization programs to program them to all come into heat or ovulate at the same time, so that you have the technician come out at one time. So those are all costs that go into AI. But the alternative is natural service, which involves having a bull on the farm. So you might think that, well, that's cheaper, but you got to think about all of what goes into keeping and maintaining the bull on the farm. Not only do you have to purchase or lease the bull, but you also have to, feed him during the breeding season, but also in the off season. And then you also have to deal with the potential for poor disposition as well. So those are some of the things you need to think about in terms of our cow management side. When we think about the calf side, there are a couple of special things we need to think about as well. There are procedures such as vaccination, deworming, and castration that generally happen on a cow-calf operation, and you'll have to develop procedures and protocols for those particular events. There's also weaning. So there are different methods of weaning that are out there. So you'll need to decide what type of method that you are comfortable with and what you are capable of doing with the facilities that you have. And then there's also this option called preconditioning, which involves weaning and vaccinating calves at least 6 weeks before they're being sold and shipped to another location. So that's something you'll want to consider when you're setting up your cow-calf operation as well. So a few questions I outlined to kind of help guide you in determining whether or not this will be a good fit for you. So you might want to ask yourself, do I have sufficient time to dedicate to certain intensive periods like calving or breeding season? Do you have a market for your calves? Do you have enough land to support the number of cows that you want to have? Do you have housing, feeding, and watering facilities available? If not, can you feasibly install them? Do you have access to supplemental feed if pasture is in poor condition? Because a cow-calf operation, even though you're calving in the spring and weaning in the fall, you're still going to have to maintain and feed those cows throughout the winter. And then, do you have access to veterinary care? I mentioned this earlier, something to consider in general, but for a cow-calf operation, it's particularly important because things sometimes do go wrong when cows calve, and you will need to call a vet at some point. At one time or another, you'll need to call the vet. All right, so going on to our next major segment of the industry, which is the stocker or the backgrounder. The goal of this operation is going to be to cheaply grow weaned calves, so from 5 to 600 pounds, into a feeder animal that's between 800 and 1,000 pounds, in preparation for finishing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some cow-calf operators will do this on their farm and just skip sending them to a stocker because it does increase the value of their calves. So in a stocker operation, these producers will feed a low-cost, high-forage diet. So to cheaply add weight to these calves. So during the spring, summer, and fall, generally they're going to be relying on high-quality pasture. In the winter, generally you're going to have to feed hay, silage, and maybe some grain in order to meet the animal's nutrient requirements. And as I said before, this does add value to the weaned calves, and you'll have heavier feeders when you go to sell them, and the finishing or feedlot operations like these feeders because they take a lot less time and a lot less grain to get to the finishing weight. If you are interested in purchasing stocker calves and just raising them for, say, the summer, for example, it's important to purchase a uniform group of weaned calves. For feeding and management purposes, it's much easier to manage a group of animals that are all about the same in terms of age and size than it is to manage, say that are 5 that are 500 pounds and 5 that are, 700 pounds and whatnot. So a uniform group is much more preferred than a non-uniform group. So if you are interested in Fallborn calves, you're going to be buying these calves in the spring, and then you'll sell these feeders in the fall or early spring. So they'll graze, if you buy them in the spring, they'll graze for the spring, summer, and in the fall, and then you'll either sell them in the fall or you'll overwinter them in winter feed and sell them as heavier feeders in the spring. For spring-born calves, you'll typically buy these calves after weaning in the fall, and then you'll overwinter feed them and then graze them in the spring and then the early summer, and then you'll sell them either in the midsummer or in late or early fall. So this type of operation is useful for someone who is only interested in having the animals around for part of the year. So some questions to ask yourself to determine if backgrounding cattle is a good fit for you. Do you have adequate forage or pasture management skills and knowledge? Again, our goal is to feed these animals cheaply, but to do that, we need to be able to manage our forage sources properly. Do you have a market for your feeders? Where are you going to sell them, and who are you going to sell them to when they're ready to go? Do you have an adequate supply of uniform calves to raise? I mentioned earlier, uniform calves are much easier to raise and manage than a group that's not uniform. Do you have enough land to support the number of cattle that you want to have? And do you have a plan for winter feeding if you purchase calves in the fall, or you plan to overwinter the fall calves to have your feeder status for sale in the spring? And the last question is, do you have access to supplemental feed if you plan to overwinter feed, or if it's during the summer when it's really hot and dry and the pasture productivity is low, do you have access to hay to feed to supplement that? Before we go into some of the nuances of a finishing operation, I just want to talk a little bit about selling cattle with specific reference to calves and stockers. There are 3 main avenues by which these animals are typically sold. The most common in our area is sale at an auction or a sale barn. So that would be sending them to somewhere like 4 States auction or something like that out in Western Maryland. The other 2 options are to sell these animals privately to a stocker or a feeder. But generally, these individuals want contracts of large groups of uniform calves. So there's a potential greater return, but on your part, it does require more networking, and you will probably need to pool loads with other farmers in the area that have similar calves to you, which can be really challenging. And then the other option for these calves are if some of them are high quality, you want to keep as breeding replacements, there is the potential to sell them to other cow-calf producers for those purposes. But again, the most common in our area is to send them to the sale barn or the auction. So I just want to walk you through kind of two examples of what that might look like if you're selling calves or selling stockers through a sale barn. For calves, for this example, I said that we had fall calves. Let's say they were born in October and we sell them in April. So they're weaned in March, we sell them in April. And let's say they're around 500 pounds when we sell them, and we sell them for $1.25 per pound. So that will yield us around $687 per head. Now that's not profit, that's just how much income is being generated from those calves. So we do need to account for our cost of production. And in a cow-calf operation, that's typically done on a per cow basis. So it's total cost of production per cow. So for this example, I said that total cost of production was $800 per cow, which is probably, it's a pretty conservative number. That's probably a little too low. And this number is going to vary from farm to farm. So when you are doing this type of assessment for your situation, you need to calculate your own cost of production. So you need to be thinking about, there's budgets that are out there through various different resources, but you need to be thinking about things like feed, land, veterinary costs, supplies, and whatnot. Those all go into cost of production. But when we do this math to figure out what our net return is, we see that there's actually a negative return. And again, this is for when we sell calves at the sale barn. So this sale price here is highly variable, and that's one of the challenges that we have with having to sell them to the sale barn like this, is because we don't really have any say in what our price per pound is going to be for our calves. For stockers, in this example, I just assumed that this is an individual who's interested in purchasing stockers in the early spring and then selling them in the late fall. So for this example, we have fall-born calves that are purchased in April. We'll assume that they're gaining about 2 pounds per day or so on pasture, and then they're sold in November. So at sale, let's say they're around 860 pounds, and then they're sold for about $1.35 a pound, and so that generates about a little over $1,100 per head. Then we also have to again consider our cost of production. So the total cost of production came out to be $975 per head, and that includes the weaned calf purchase price. So let's say they were 500 pounds and we bought them for $1.15 a pound, for a total of $575 a head, plus our other expenses, which totaled out to be, let's say, around $400 per head. Again, this is just a ballpark estimate. You'll have to run the numbers for your own situation to get a more accurate assessment for you. And when we do the math on this one, we see that our net return is almost $200 per head. So in this situation, you can kind of see why a cow-calf producer might want to raise, instead of selling their calves right after weaning, they might want to raise them out to a higher weight and sell as heavier feeder cattle because it might be more profitable. Again, though, this is highly dependent on this price that you're getting per pound when you sell them. As well, in this situation, it is dependent on how much you purchase them for as well. So going into some of the basics for a finishing operation. So someone who's finishing cattle, their goal is to raise calves, so 500 or 600 pounds, or feeder cattle, so 800 to a 1,000 pound animal, to a finished weight on grass or grain. So a finished weight is going to be between 1,000 or 1,100 to 1,400 pounds. In a finishing operation, cattle are going to be finished or fattened on a nutrient-dense diet. So in a lot of cases, that's going to be a high-grain diet. In some cases, it's going to be a high-quality grass diet, or it could be a combination of the two. But the feeding program that is decided upon is going to depend on the producer's goals and their capabilities, as well as the purchaser's demand. So again, that comes into play, or that brings back into play what your buyer wants from you. So just to give a little bit of a comparison between grain finished and grass finished and what that actually means, I use the term grass finished because grass fed is kind of misleading in that a large portion of most cattle in the country are actually primarily raised on pasture for a good portion of their lives until they enter the feedlot. So I say grass finished because that's what they're eating during that finishing phase, which is usually what the difference is. So a grain finished animal is going to be fed a high grain diet from weaning or backgrounding until harvest, whereas a grass finished animal is going to be fed high quality forages or grasses from weaning or backgrounding through harvest. A grain finished animal is going to finish out at a little bit of a higher weight than a grass finished animal, and that's primarily because our grain finished animals are going to gain a little bit more fat than our grass finished animals. Age at finish will also vary. So our grain finished animals are going to be younger at harvest, usually between 14 and 22 months, whereas our grass finished animals are going to be a little bit older, between 24 and 30 months. And that's basically attributed to different rates of growth. So our grain finished animals are going to grow much more rapidly than our grass finished cattle. Grain finished cattle are also more likely to grade prime or choice because they are depositing, grain diets will encourage them to deposit more of that intramuscular fat that affects the quality grain. Grass finished animals, I'm not saying it's impossible to grade prime, but it's more difficult to grade prime or choice with grass finished animals. So that's something to consider if you're after quality premiums in a grass finished operation. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible, it's just more difficult to achieve. A grain finished operation is generally something that's generally a facility where animals are going to be in confinement. So there's going to be more facility inputs with a grain finished operation compared to a grass finished operation. So that can play into your cost of production. As well as the grain operations are going to be highly dependent on grain prices. So that can be a big challenge for those individuals. Whereas grass finishers don't necessarily rely on grain prices, but they do have to have a sufficient supply of good quality forage, and that can be a challenge during certain times of the year. So if you're deciding, whether you want to purchase cattle and finish them, or if you want to, finish cattle on your cow-calf operation, some questions you should ask are whether or not you have adequate facilities for the type of feeding system you want to pursue. So if you want to, do a grain finished based system, you have, a feeding area in a barn or something to that effect. If you're on the flip side, if you're pursuing grass finishing, do you have a sufficient supply of high quality forage and land available to make this happen? And then lastly, do you have a market for your finished cattle? Are you going to sell them to the auction barn, or are you going to sell them through some other means to either a packer directly, or are you going to sell them to the consumer? So when we're selling finished cattle, I kind of just alluded to it, but there are three main places that finished cattle will go. In our area, it's pretty common to sell direct to consumers, as well as the sale or auction barn. But there's also the possibility of private sale to a packer. These first two, direct to consumers or private sale to a packer, offer a greater potential return, but again, do require more marketing and networking on your part. So if you're not interested in the marketing or networking part, those might not be the routes you want to go for selling your animals. So the major question a lot of folks will have is, should you rear your calves to a finished weight, or should you sell them as weaned calves or as stockers? Well, that all comes down to your cost of production. And to estimate your cost of production, you need to think about things like labor, land, feed, and miscellaneous management expenses such as supplies and veterinary expenses, etc. It's important to have your cost of production in mind because, especially if you're planning to direct market your product, you need to be able to set a competitive price that will also cover your cost of production and hopefully exceed that cost of production so you do make some sort of profit. If you are going to be selling your animals through auction sales, just know that you're going to be at the mercy of the market and there will be highs and lows, and that will greatly impact how profitable your operation is. If you're considering direct marketing, there's a few things you should think about as well. The first is to identify your target consumer and also what they want. Do they want organic? Do they want grass-finished beef? Or do they simply just want local beef and they don't care if it's grass-finished or organic? Those are important things to think about. And a lot of times you can get this information by just talking with people or talking with other producers in your area. You also need to develop a marketing plan. I'm not a marketing specialist, but I do know that in the age of technology, a website and social media are pretty much standards in terms of direct marketing, and you need to have those in place in order to be successful. Print material is also useful, but again, the electronic information is very, very important in terms of direct marketing success. You also need to decide how you're going to sell your meat. Are you going to sell it pre-harvest? So are you going to sell a whole animal to a consumer and have them be responsible for processing it? Or are you going to process it and then repackage and resell either like a half side beef, a quarter beef, or different, just individual by the pound cuts? You can do a combination of all three, but you need to decide that and start thinking about that ahead of time. You need to determine your cost of production so that you do set a profitable price for your product. But again, you need to make sure that that price is still competitive with your with other individuals who are also selling that type of product. It's a good idea to develop relationships with your local processing facilities that you'll be using to process your animals, and also make sure that they do have the proper certification for you to resell your product. And it's also important to talk with others who direct market beef and develop relationships with those individuals. Those relationships will serve you very well in the future, not only in terms of you learning from them, but also them referring others to you if they have an issue with something in their supply chain. All right, let's say that you've decided what you want to do, you're ready to go, you're ready to sign the papers and start your beef operation. So what are some challenges that you might run into in this region, or what are some challenges for our beef producers in this region? One of the biggest challenges for our Mid-Atlantic producers is the fact that we have small herds. And selling large uniform groups of calves or cattle is challenging, and a lot of private sale to individual packers or feedlots, they really want large uniform groups of animals. So that can be a challenge, and that's why a lot of our small producers do send the animals through the stockyard or through the sale auction barn. Another challenge is feed costs, and that would be attributed to grain and supplemental hay. So over 20% of the total production costs for livestock in this region is attributed to feed costs. And a lot of times we can't purchase feed in bulk because our operations aren't big enough to do so. So that is definitely a challenge for our small producers. Labor costs and availability, not so much a huge challenge for beef production, but still a challenge nonetheless. It can be difficult to find labor to help you. Say in the summer, if you make your own hay, if you need help unloading that hay, or in some way, shape, or form in the processing or production of that hay, it can be difficult to find labor. It can also be difficult to find people that are willing to help you care for your animals if you have to go on vacation or if you have to travel for work, if you have a different, another job, that can be hard to come by. Land cost is another challenge for our producers in this region. So a lot of folks will rent land because they can't afford to purchase it. The farm real estate value in the U.S. last year was around $3,100 per acre. In Maryland, that number was over $8,000 per acre. In Delaware, it was almost $9,000, and in Pennsylvania, it was almost $6,500. So again, land prices can be a pretty significant challenge for these producers, especially if you're looking to buy or expand your operation. So a lot of folks will end up renting for that reason. But we do have to balance out our challenges with some of the opportunities we do have in this region. The first opportunity is for direct marketing. We already kind of talked about that. And direct marketing has the opportunity to help make your farm more profitable. It also helps producers build relationships with consumers, which not only benefits them from a business standpoint, but also benefits the industry as a whole. And a lot of folks that do pursue direct marketing do find it as a rewarding experience. So that's something else to consider if that's the route that you're interested in pursuing. And then we also have unique products or niche markets as well. So a lot of our producers pursue grass-finished types of products. Some people will do custom backgrounding or finishing of cattle on pasture and whatnot. And then we also have a portion of producers who are purebred and do produce breeding stock for other cow-calf producers. So some of the take-home messages for today that I just want to leave you with. The first thing you need to do before you get started is to identify your goals before you start. What is your end product? Who are you going to sell it to? Where are you going to sell it, and how are you going to do it? The next thing is to observe and build relationships with other producers with similar goals. This doesn't just apply to folks that are direct marketing, but if you have a calf operation and you want to sell weaned calves, maybe talk with some other folks in your area who are doing that type of operation already, and they'll undoubtedly have some advice for you. It's important to be realistic with regards to your capabilities when deciding your production path. And this is really important, especially when it comes to time management. If you have another job, if you are working your primary job, you travel 80% of the time, a cow-calf operation may not be the best fit for you at this time, unless you have someone that can help you during the intense times. So be realistic. It's important to be realistic with what you are actually capable of doing. And the last thing is to be flexible. And then know that your path might change over the years as you grow and change, as your life situation changes, or as your market changes. So maybe your direct market, the consumer demand changes. So maybe you'll have to change how you produce your animals. Maybe they want grass-fed instead of grain finished. So you'll have to make adjustments there if you need to. And with that, we'll wrap it up. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will answer them.
That was great, Sarah. Thank you very much. Just monitoring the chat pod right now to see if anybody has any questions. Sarah, her email is there if anyone wants to reach out individually. We will be posting and emailing out a recording as well as her slide set. So all of that will be coming out to you within the next day or so. Oh, we got something down here in the Q&A. Let's see. Oh, no questions. Okay. All right, you're getting some good feedback, Sarah. Yep, great overview. Thank you for your time. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just stop recording. We'll see if there's any emails or questions coming through. Okay, yep, there's any recommendations for specific types of breed?
Yeah, so I didn't put that in here. I thought about doing it, but then I was afraid I'd go over. So for breed, there's a lot of options out there, but around here, in terms of marketing and selling animals at the sale barn specifically, anything with a black hide, like Angus, is generally going to give you a higher premium. But if you're selling direct to your customer, you know, you can be a little bit more flexible in the breed that you do have. I'm not saying you have to have Angus or what have you, but that's just something that I have learned since I've been in this position, that everyone wants a black-hided animal. So I don't know if that helps in deciding what breed that to choose, but that's what I would say. I see a question here about the number of cows and calves you would recommend starting with if you have no experience. I'm not sure that there's like a gold standard number. I would go through that assessment to see what your particular facilities are capable of handling at one time. And then, you know, obviously that would give you like the maximum that you could have and then work down from there. If you have no experience, I would start with less than 10 probably, but that's my personal opinion. And then, of course, you can always add every year to that number as you feel comfortable, or cut back if it's too much for you.